The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant James Orson Games Morrison stood at his post near the East Wing entrance. He had served in the Royal Guard for 15 years, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication and silence. Nothing in his military training, however, could have prepared him for what he would witness on that chilly October morning. James had always been the picture of discipline. His uniform was impeccable, his posture perfect, and his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Fellow guards often joked that he was made of stone, never showing emotion regardless of the chaos that sometimes unfolded around the palace grounds. Tourists would try to make him laugh, children would wave enthusiastically, but James remained steadfast and unmoved. That morning started like any other. The changing of the guard had just completed, and James took his position outside the private family quarters. The palace was quieter than usual, as many senior royals were away on official duties. Only a handful of family members remained in residence, including young Prince Louis, who had stayed behind while his parents attended an overseas engagement around 10:30. James noticed unusual movement in the corridor behind him. He heard raised voices, something rare in the normally composed environment of the palace. Prince Louis, now a young teenager, emerged from a side door looking distressed. His face was flushed, and his eyes were red as if he had been crying. The young prince was known for his cheerful disposition and playful nature, so seeing him in such a state immediately alarmed James. Before James could process what was happening, Tom Parker Bowles, the son of Queen Camilla from her first marriage, appeared in the corridor. Tom was a well-known food writer and critic, someone who occasionally visited his mother at the palace, but typically kept a low profile regarding royal affairs. Today, however, his presence seemed to carry a different weight. Prince Louis stopped abruptly when he saw Tom approaching. The boy's hands were trembling, and he looked around as if searching for an escape route. James, trained to remain neutral and invisible, felt his heart rate quicken. Something was terribly wrong. Every instinct told him to pay attention. Tom reached out toward Prince Louis, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a comforting gesture. But Louis recoiled violently, his voice rising in panic. The words that came from the young prince's mouth made James's blood run cold. Though he forced himself to remain still and professional, the confrontation escalated quickly. Louis began speaking rapidly, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He spoke about encounters that had made him uncomfortable, about moments when he felt trapped and afraid. He mentioned private rooms in lesser-used sections of the palace, times when he was alone with Tom during family gatherings, and the growing sense of dread he felt whenever Camilla's son was around. James felt sweat forming on his brow despite the cool morning air. His training dictated that he should remain an observer, that royal family matters were not his concern unless physical danger was imminent. But as he listened to the young prince's anguished confession, as he heard the fear and pain in that young voice, something inside him began to crack. Tom's demeanor changed from seemingly concerned to defensive. He spoke in urgent, low tones, trying to calm Louis down and suggesting they discuss the matter privately. But Louis refused, his voice growing louder and more desperate. He demanded to speak with his parents immediately, insisted that palace security be notified, and stated clearly that he would not remain silent any longer. Other staff members began to appear, drawn by the commotion. A senior lady-in-waiting emerged from an office, her face showing immediate concern. Palace security personnel started moving toward the scene, the professional training kicking in as they assessed the situation. The atmosphere shifted from routine morning operations to a crisis unfolding in real time. James watched as Louis turned and noticed him standing at his post. The young prince's eyes locked onto the guard, and in that moment James saw something that would haunt him forever. He saw complete terror mixed with desperate hope. The look of a child who had been carrying an unbearable burden and was finally releasing it. Into the world, Louis approached James directly. Standing just feet away from the stoic guard, tears streamed down the prince's face as he began to speak again. This time directing his words toward the one person who had been silently witnessing everything. The young royal's voice cracked with emotion as he recounted specific incidents. naming dates and locations within the palace walls. The details Louis shared were horrifying. He spoke of being cornered in the palace library during a family celebration, of inappropriate comments made when no one else was around, of feeling manipulated and controlled through threats that no one would believe him if he spoke out. He described how Tom had used his position as the queen's son to gain access and trust, how he had exploited moments when the young prince was vulnerable and alone. James felt his carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crumble. His jaw clenched beneath his bearskin hat, and his fingers tightened around his rifle. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, and now he was hearing that one of them had been suffering under his very watch. The guilt and anger surged through him like a tidal wave. Threatening to break through his professional composure, Tom attempted to interrupt Louis multiple times, his voice rising in protest. He called the allegations absurd, suggested the boy was confused or had misunderstood innocent interactions. But Louis stood firm, his courage growing with each word he spoke. The young prince refused to be silenced or dismissed, insisting that what had happened to him was real and wrong. Palace security moved to separate Tom from Louis, their movements swift and professional. The senior lady-in-waiting placed a protective arm around the young prince, guiding him away from the confrontation. But Louis resisted for a moment, turning back to look at James's one final time. In that glance, James saw gratitude mixed with pain, recognition that his silent presence had given the boy strength to finally speak his truth, as Louis was led away to safety. As Tom was escorted in another direction for questioning, James remained at his post. His body stayed rigid and professional, but inside, everything was falling apart. The weight of what he had witnessed pressed down on him with crushing force. He thought of his own children at home, of the Trust family's place in those around them, of the betrayal that had occurred within these historic walls. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. James stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the far wall, but seeing nothing. His mind raced with questions and emotions he had spent years learning to suppress. Should he have noticed something earlier? Were there signs he had missed? Could he have prevented any of this? Then, without warning, it happened. A single tear escaped from James's right eye, rolling slowly down his weathered cheek. It was followed by another, and then another. The stone facade that had defined Sergeant James Morrison for 15 years shattered completely. His shoulders began to shake, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced. The rifle in his hands trembled despite his grip. Other guards noticed immediately. It was unprecedented, shocking, completely against every rule and tradition of the Royal Guard, but none of them moved to correct him or remind him of protocol. They had all heard what had transpired, and they understood that some moments transcend duty and decorum. They formed a subtle, protective barrier around James, shielding him from public view while he experienced his very human response to an inhuman situation. A senior officer approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on James's shoulder. He spoke in a low, compassionate voice, telling James that he was being relieved of duty for the day, that counseling services would be made available, and that what he had witnessed was something no one should have to process alone. James nodded mutely, unable to trust his voice, and allowed himself to be led away from his post as he walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace that morning. Tears still streaming down his face, Sergeant James Morrison knew that everything had changed. The palace he had served so faithfully would never look the same to him again. The royal family he had protected with his life was facing a crisis that would shake its very foundations. And the young prince, whose courage had brought dark secrets into the light, would need protection of a kind that went far beyond standing guard. The doorways dot the investigation that would follow. The questions that would be asked, and the consequences that would unfold, were just beginning. But in that moment, all James could think about was the terrified face of Prince Louis and the horrifying confession that had shattered not just a guard's composure, but the illusion of safety within the palace walls. The private rooms of Buckingham Palace had never felt so suffocating to Catherine, Princess of Wales. She and Prince William had been urgently summoned back from their diplomatic tour of Canada. Given only the briefest of explanations over a secure phone line, The 10-hour flight had been agonizing, filled with worst-case scenarios running through their minds. When their plane finally touched down at RAF Northolt, a somber-faced aide met them on the tarmac, with a car ready to rush them directly to the palace. William's knuckles were white as he gripped Catherine's hand in the back seat. Neither spoke during the drive through London. The city passed by in a blur of lights and landmarks that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the crisis waiting for them. Catherine kept replaying the aide's words in her mind, words that had stopped her heart mid-beat during that phone call. Prince Louis had made serious allegations, palace security was involved, and the matter required their immediate return. Upon arrival, they were led not to the usual family quarters, but to a secure conference room in the administrative wing. Waiting for them were Sir Edward Young, the private secretary, Detective Chief Inspector Margaret Thornton from the Metropolitan Police, and Dr. Sarah Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. The gravity of the situation was written on every face in that room. What they heard in the next hour changed everything they thought. They knew about their family's safety. DCI Thornton walked them through Lewis's allegations methodically and professionally. But her voice carried an undercurrent of carefully controlled anger. Tom Parker Bowles had been accused of grooming behavior, inappropriate touching, and creating situations where Louis felt endangered and powerless. The incidents had allegedly occurred over the past 18 months, during various family gatherings and official events. Catherine felt physically ill as the details emerged. Her youngest son, her baby, had been suffering in silence while they smiled for cameras and attended state dinners. She thought back to every family holiday at Balmoral, every Christmas celebration, every supposedly joyful occasion where Tom had been present. Had she missed the signs? Had Louis tried to tell her in ways she failed to understand? William's reaction was more immediate and visceral. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, and paced to the window with his hands clenched into fists. His breathing was heavy and controlled, the way someone breathes when trying desperately not to explode. Catherine knew her husband well enough to recognize that he was balancing on a knife's edge between his role as a future king and his primal instinct as a father. Dr. Chen explained gently that Louis was safe now, currently in a secure wing of the palace with trusted personnel. The boy had specifically requested to speak with his parents before anyone else, and she recommended they see him as soon as possible. However, she cautioned them about their approach. Louis needed to feel believed, supported, and protected, not interrogated or doubted. Their response in the next hours would significantly impact his ability to heal from this trauma. The walk to see their son felt endless. Palace corridors that Catherine had walked thousands of times seemed foreign and threatening now. Every portrait on the walls, every piece of historic furniture, every symbol of royal tradition suddenly represented a system that had failed to protect her child. She held William's arm not just for support, but to ground him, to remind him that Louis needed his father's strength, not his rage. Louis sat on a sofa in a private sitting room. Wrapped in a blanket despite the room's warmth, a female protection officer stood discreetly near the door, and a counselor sat quietly in the corner, ready to intervene if needed. But when Louis saw his parents, all the bravery he had mustered that morning evaporated. He ran to them, collapsing into their embrace as sobs racked his thin frame. Catherine held her son as if she could physically absorb his pain. She whispered words of love and reassurance, stroking his hair the way she had when he was small and had nightmares. But this was no nightmare he could wake from. This was real, and the horror of that reality pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. William wrapped his arms around them both, his face buried in Lewis's hair. And Catherine could feel her husband's tears soaking into her shoulder. When Louis finally found his voice, the story that emerged was worse than they had imagined. It had started innocently enough, Tom showing interest in Lewis's hobbies and offering to help him with school projects. The attention had felt special at first, particularly during times when William and Catherine were busy with royal duties. Tom had positioned himself as a cool, older figure, someone Louis could talk to about things he might feel uncomfortable discussing with his parents, but the boundaries had shifted gradually. Private conversations became too private, with Tom suggesting they meet away from others. Compliments became uncomfortably personal. Physical contact that started as casual shoulder pats or hair ruffles evolved into longer embraces and touches that made Lewis's skin crawl. Tom had a way of cornering him in rooms during family events, always with an excuse that sounded reasonable but left Louis feeling trapped and wrong. The young prince described how Tom would make comments about his appearance, suggesting Louis was becoming handsome in ways that made the boy want to disappear. There were gifts given privately, accompanied by requests that Louis not mention them to others. Tom had created a web of secrets using the guise of a special bond to isolate Louis from those who might protect him. The manipulation was sophisticated and deliberate, designed to make Louis feel complicit and afraid to speak out. One incident stood out with particular horror. During a weekend at Highgrove, Tom had found Louis alone in the estate's library. The conversation had turned inappropriate, with Tom making suggestions about experiences Louis should try as he got older. When Louis tried to leave, Tom had blocked the door, not physically restraining him, but making it clear through his presence and words that Louis was not in control of the situation. The boy had felt genuine fear that day, a fear that had haunted him ever since. What made it worse was Tom's insurance policy against exposure. He had told Louis repeatedly that no one would believe allegations against Camilla's son, that it would cause a massive rift in the family, that Louis would be blamed for destroying the carefully built harmony between the Wales and Parker Bowles families. He had weaponized Lewis's love for his family and his understanding of royal duty to keep him silent. William listened to his son's account with a face that had turned to stone. Catherine could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, the only outward sign of the inferno raging inside him. When Louis finished speaking, collapsing back into exhausted silence, William gently tilted his son's face up to meet his eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with emotion but utterly firm. He told Louis that none of this was his fault, that predators like Tom were skilled at manipulation, that speaking out had been the bravest thing Louis could have done. William promised that Louis would be protected, that justice would be pursued regardless of the consequences, and that no one in the family would ever doubt or blame him for what had happened. The future king's voice broke as he assured his son that the fault lay entirely with an adult who had betrayed trust and abused his position. Catherine added her own reassurances, apologizing for not creating an environment where Louis felt safe enough to speak earlier. She acknowledged that the demands of royal life had sometimes meant they were not as available as they should have been, and she promised that would change immediately. Louis was more important than any duty, any engagement, any expectation placed upon them by tradition or protocol. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. DCI Thornton returned to conduct a formal interview with Louis, recorded and handled with all the care afforded to a child victim of abuse. Dr. Chen remained present throughout. Ensuring Lewis's well-being took priority over investigative needs. William and Catherine stayed by their son's side, occasionally having to step out when their emotions threatened to overwhelm them, in a separate wing of the palace. Tom Parker Bowles was being questioned by police. His initial denials had given way to claims of misunderstanding, suggestions that Lewis had misconstrued friendly mentorship. But as investigators presented specific allegations with dates and details, his story began to shift. Experienced detectives recognized the patterns of someone who had done this before, someone who knew how to manipulate and had counted on his victim's silence. The most devastating aspect came when investigators reviewed palace security footage from the periods Louis had mentioned. While cameras did not cover private family areas, they did capture public corridors and entrances. The footage showed Tom frequently positioning himself near areas where Louis would be alone, lingering in corridors when other family members had departed, and on several occasions, following the young prince into sections of the palace with fewer staff present. When Catherine and William were shown this evidence later that evening, the visual confirmation of their son's testimony was somehow even more painful than the words. Seeing the predatory behavior captured on camera, watching Tom deliberately create opportunities to access their vulnerable child, filled them with a rage that had no outlet sufficient to contain it. The question of what to tell Camilla loomed over everything. As Tom's mother and as queen consort, she would need to be informed immediately. But the timing and manner of that notification carried enormous implications. William insisted on being present when she was told, partly out of respect for his stepmother, but also out of a need to ensure. Louis's allegations were taken seriously at the highest levels of the family. King Charles was informed shortly after midnight. He had been at a private estate in Scotland and immediately arranged to return to London. The king's reaction, conveyed through his private secretary, was one of profound shock and anger. He requested an emergency meeting with William, Catherine, and his chief advisors for the following morning. The institution itself was now in crisis mode. As dawn broke over London, Catherine sat beside Louis's bed in the secure wing, watching her son sleep fitfully. William had finally stepped away to shower and change, but she could not bring herself to leave. She studied her son's face, still so young, despite the recent growth spurts and deepening voice. She could see the traces of tears on his cheeks, the tension even in sleep, the loss of innocence that could never be restored. A soft knock at the door announced Dr. Chen's arrival with morning tea. The psychologist sat beside Catherine, not speaking at first, just being present in the heavy silence. Finally, she said quietly that Louis had been incredibly brave, that his decision to speak out had likely prevented other potential victims, and that with proper support, he could heal from this trauma. But Catherine barely heard the words. All she could think about was the years of trust her son would need to rebuild. The therapy that lay ahead, the ways this violation would ripple through his entire life. William returned looking haggard but determined. He had just received word that Tom Parker Bowles had been formally arrested, was being held for questioning at a police facility outside the palace. The investigation would proceed with full criminal justice protocols regardless of his connection to the royal family. There would be no cover-up, no quiet settlement, no protection offered because of his mother's position. But now came the hardest part. In just a few hours, they would need to face Camilla and tell her that her son stood accused of predatory behavior against her step-grandson. They would need to navigate the collision between familial loyalty and justice, between institutional preservation and moral imperative. The conversation would shatter relationships and test the very foundations of the modern royal family. Catherine looked at her husband and saw the weight of impossible choices bearing down on him. He was a father demanding justice for his son, but he was also second in line to the throne. Bound by duties and protocols that had been established over centuries, William met her gaze, and in that moment, she saw him make his choice. He would be a father first, let the consequences fall where they may. Queen Camilla arrived at Buckingham Palace at precisely 9 in the morning, summoned by an urgent message from King Charles. She had been at Clarence House, preparing for a scheduled engagement with a children's literacy charity, when the call came through. The tone of the king's private secretary had been enough to tell her something serious had occurred, but nothing could have prepared her for the news that awaited. King Charles met her in his private study, a room heavy with history and the weight of monarchy. His face was drawn, aged overnight it seemed, and he could barely meet her eyes as she entered. Camilla felt fear grip her heart even before he spoke. In their years together, she had seen him weather political storms, family tragedies, and public scrutiny. But never had she seen him look so devastated and conflicted. The king guided her to a chair before taking her hands in his. His voice was gentle, but steady as he told her that Tom had been arrested following serious allegations made by Prince Louis. Camilla's first reaction was disbelief, then immediate denial. There must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. Tom was her son, someone she had raised and thought she knew completely. The idea that he could harm a child, particularly Louis, seemed impossible to reconcile with the person she believed him to be. But Charles continued, his words carefully chosen but unflinching. He described the nature of Louis's allegations, the pattern of grooming behavior, the investigation that was now underway. He explained that William and Catherine were prepared to pursue this matter to its full legal conclusion, that palace security footage supported aspects of Louis's account, and that Tom's own statements to police had been inconsistent and troubling. Camilla pulled her hands away, standing abruptly and moving to the window. Her mind raced through memories, searching for signs she might have missed, moments that should have raised alarms. She thought of family gatherings where Tom and Louis had interacted, conversations where Tom had mentioned spending time with the young prince. At the time, she had been pleased that her son was building a relationship with Charles's grandson, seeing it as a positive bridge between the blended families. Now those same memories took on a sinister cast. Had Tom's interest in Louis been genuine familial affection, or something far darker? Had she unknowingly facilitated access to a vulnerable child? The questions threatened to overwhelm her. But the mother in her still wanted to defend her son, to believe there was another explanation that would make sense of all this. William and Catherine joined the meeting shortly after, their arrival announced by a soft knock. The tension in the room became almost unbearable as they entered. Camilla saw immediately the transformation in them, particularly in William. This was not the stepson she had come to know over the years, the man who had gradually accepted her place in his father's life. This was a father in protective rage, barely contained beneath a veneer of royal composure. Catherine's appearance was equally striking. Her usual polish was gone, replaced by exhaustion and raw emotion. But her eyes, when they met Camilla's, held something fierce and uncompromising. This was a mother who would burn down the world to protect her child. And Camilla recognized that nothing she could say would soften that resolve. William spoke first, his voice controlled but cold. He laid out the timeline of Louis's allegations in clinical detail, sparing Camilla nothing. He described the emotional state in which they had found their son, the terror and shame Louis had carried for months while Tom systematically groomed and manipulated him. William made it clear that this was not a family matter to be resolved privately, but a criminal case that would proceed through proper legal channels regardless of the personal cost to anyone in the room. Camilla listened, feeling her world collapse around her. She wanted to interrupt, to defend Tom, to suggest alternative explanations. But the specific details William recounted, the evidence he referenced, and most damning of all, the fact that Tom's own statements had evolved under police questioning, made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. Still, the mother in her rebelled against accepting that her son could be capable of such predatory behavior. She asked to speak with Tom directly, to hear his side of the story. William's response was immediate and firm. Tom was in police custody and would remain there pending further investigation. Any contact with him would need to be arranged through proper legal channels with appropriate oversight. William made it clear that he would not allow any attempt to influence Tom's statements or coordinate stories. Even unintentionally, the accusation implicit in William's words struck Camilla like a physical blow. He was suggesting she might try to protect Tom at Louis's expense, that maternal loyalty might override moral duty. She felt anger rise in her chest, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that from William's perspective, such concerns were entirely justified. He was protecting his child from any threat, and at this moment, her family represented that threat. King Charles attempted to mediate, his voice heavy with the burden of being caught between his wife and his grandson. He emphasized that everyone in the room wanted the truth to emerge, that justice needed to be served regardless of family connections. But his words felt hollow in the face of the crisis, tearing through the family's foundations. How could there be reconciliation when a child had been violated by someone they should have been able to trust? Catherine finally spoke, her voice quieter than William's, but no less powerful. She addressed Camilla directly, woman to woman, mother to mother. She described finding Louis in the state of psychological distress that no parent should ever witness. She spoke of the nightmares her son had been having, the anxiety that had manifested in changes to his behavior that they now understood in horrifying clarity. Catherine's voice broke as she explained that Louis had lost his sense of safety, that he flinched when approached unexpectedly, that he was terrified of being alone in certain parts of the palace. The raw pain in Catherine's words seemed to penetrate Camilla's defenses in a way that William's anger could not. She saw reflected in Catherine's anguish the nightmare every mother fears, the violation of a child's innocence and security. Camilla had her own grandchildren, and the thought of anyone harming them in the way Louis described filled her with rage. But that rage was immediately complicated by the fact that the alleged perpetrator was her own son. She asked what evidence existed beyond Louis's statements. DCI Thornton, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. The detective explained that while the investigation was ongoing, preliminary findings were deeply concerning. Security footage showed a pattern of Tom seeking out opportunities to be alone with Louis, Palace staff members, when interviewed, had recalled instances where Tom's behavior around the young prince seemed inappropriately familiar. Most significantly, a forensic examination of Tom's personal devices was underway, and early results suggested searches and communications that aligned with predatory grooming patterns. Camilla felt her knees weaken and reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. The clinical recitation of evidence was stripping away her ability to maintain denial. She thought of Tom as a little boy, the son she had raised and loved, the man who had built a successful career and seemed to live a normal life. Where had it gone wrong? Had there been signs throughout his life that she had missed or excused? The guilt and horror of these questions threatened to drown her. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, what they wanted from her. William's response was immediate. He wanted her to accept the reality of the situation, to cooperate fully with the investigation, and most importantly, to make no attempt to minimize or explain away Tom's actions. He needed to know that she would prioritize Louis's well-being and the pursuit of justice, over protecting her son from consequences. The request was eminently reasonable, but Camilla felt torn in directions that seemed impossible to reconcile. How could she turn her back on her own child, even if the evidence suggested he had done something terrible? But how could she defend him when that defense would compound the trauma of a 14-year-old boy who was also family? The conflict between maternal instinct and moral imperative created a paralysis that left her unable to respond. King Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch conveying both support and pressure. He spoke softly, reminding her that their positions in the royal family carried responsibilities that sometimes superseded personal feelings. The monarchy's credibility depended on being seen to value justice over privilege, on protecting the vulnerable rather than the powerful. He was, in his careful way, telling her what choice she needed to make. Camilla looked at William and Catherine, saw the pain and determination in their faces, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had spent years working to be accepted as part of this family, to overcome the complicated history and public skepticism. She had built relationships slowly and carefully, earning trust through consistency and genuine care. All of that would mean nothing if she chose wrong in this moment. She took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. She told William and Catherine that Louis must be believed and protected above all else. She acknowledged that the evidence was deeply troubling and that her personal feelings about Tom could not interfere with the investigation. She committed to cooperating fully with authorities and to making no attempt to influence the process or outcome. And then, her voice breaking, she apologized for the pain her son had caused and for any failure on her part to recognize warning signs that should have been apparent. The apology did not erase the damage, and Camilla could see that William and Catherine were not ready to grant forgiveness or absolution. But there was a slight relaxation in their posture, an acknowledgement that she had said what needed to be said. The path forward would still be agonizingly difficult, but at least they would not be fighting on opposite sides of the fundamental question of what mattered most. DCI Thornton outlined the next steps in the investigation. Tom would be formally interviewed multiple times, with increasing confrontation, as detectives built their case. Louis would need to participate in additional evidence-gathering sessions, though these would be handled with extreme sensitivity to his age and trauma. A forensic psychologist would evaluate Tom to assess his pattern of behavior and likelihood of reoffending. The Crown Prosecution Service would ultimately decide whether to press charges based on the totality of evidence. The detective made it clear that the royal family's cooperation, or lack thereof, would be noted and could impact public perception of the case. She did not need to elaborate on the implications. If the family was seen as protecting one of their own at the expense of a child victim, the damage to the monarchy's reputation could be catastrophic. They all understood that this case would eventually become public knowledge, and how they handled it would be scrutinized intensely. William brought up a concern that had been weighing on him. If charges were filed and the case went to trial, Louis would potentially need to testify. The trauma of that experience, the public exposure, and the defense tactics that might be employed against a child witness filled him with dread. He wanted assurances that every possible measure would be taken to protect his son through the legal process. DCI Thornton explained the special measures available for child witnesses, including pre-recorded testimony, screens to prevent the defendant from viewing the witness, and restrictions on cross-examination. But she was honest about the challenges. Defense attorneys, even in cases involving minors, had a job to do. They would question inconsistencies, probe memories, and attempt to create reasonable doubt. It would be difficult, and Louis would need significant support to endure it. Catherine's face had gone pale as she listened to this explanation. The thought of Louis having to relive his trauma in a courtroom, being questioned about the worst experiences of his young life, seemed unbearable. She asked whether there was any way to avoid a trial, and the room fell into uncomfortable silence. Everyone knew what that meant: a plea bargain, where Tom would admit to lesser charges in exchange for avoiding a full trial. William rejected the idea immediately. He wanted full accountability, a complete acknowledgement of what Tom had done, and a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crimes. He was not interested in a compromise that would spare anyone discomfort or embarrassment. His son deserved justice, not a negotiated settlement that prioritized convenience over truth. The meeting concluded with no clear resolution, only an agreement to move forward step by painful step. Camilla left feeling as though she had aged years in a single morning. Her relationship with her son was now mediated through lawyers and police. Her place in the royal family felt precarious, dependent on actions that went against every maternal instinct, while aligning with every moral principle she claimed to hold. The woman who had fought so hard to be accepted was now fighting to prove she deserved that acceptance by holding her own child accountable for monstrous actions. 3 months had passed since that terrible October morning, and Buckingham Palace had become a place of carefully maintained secrets and barely concealed tension. The investigation into Tom Parker Bowles had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations, revealing a pattern of behavior far more extensive than Louis's allegations alone had suggested. 2 other young people had come forward after learning of the investigation, each describing similar experiences with Tom during different periods over the past 5 years. Sergeant James Morrison had returned to duty after 2 weeks of mandatory counseling and leave. But he was forever changed by what he had witnessed. The palace had offered him a transfer to different duties, perhaps something less emotionally demanding, but James had refused. He felt a personal responsibility to be present, to stand as a silent witness to justice, being pursued even in the most protected corridors of power. His fellow guards treated him with new respect, understanding that his tears that morning had represented something profoundly human breaking through military discipline. The palace staff whispered about what was happening, though official statements remained vague. They spoke of meetings behind closed doors, of royal family members arriving at odd hours, the tension that seemed to permeate every room. Some staff members had been interviewed by police, asked about their observations of Tom's behavior during his visits. The process had been unsettling, forcing everyone to reconsider interactions they had previously dismissed as unremarkable. Prince Louis had been moved temporarily to Anmer Hall in Norfolk. Away from the palace and its triggering memories, Catherine had suspended most of her royal duties to be with him. While William juggled his obligations with frequent trips to Norfolk, the family had essentially gone into protective withdrawal. Creating a safe space for Louis to begin the difficult work of healing, Dr. Chen visited regularly, conducting therapy sessions. It slowly helped the young prince process his trauma and rebuild his sense of security. The therapy revealed additional details that Louis had initially been too ashamed to share. Tom's manipulation had included showing Louis's inappropriate content online, suggesting it was part of normal growing up and bonding. He had made Louis promise never to tell anyone about their conversations, framing the secrecy as evidence of their special connection. The psychological damage went deeper than anyone had first understood, affecting Louis's trust in adults, his comfort in social situations, and his relationship with his own developing identity. George and Charlotte had been told an age-appropriate version of what had happened to their brother. They struggled to understand why family gatherings had stopped, why certain people were no longer mentioned, and why Louis sometimes woke up crying at night. William and Catherine tried to balance honesty with protection, wanting their older children to understand the importance of speaking up about uncomfortable situations while not burdening them with details they were too young to process. The Crown Prosecution Service had finally made their decision in late January. Tom Parker Bowles would be charged with multiple counts related to child sexual exploitation and grooming. The charges carried significant potential sentences, and the strength of evidence made a conviction likely if the case went to trial. Tom's legal team had immediately begun negotiating, seeking a plea arrangement that would avoid the public spectacle and trauma of a trial. William had been consulted about the possibility of accepting a plea, and his response had been measured but firm. He would accept a guilty plea only if Tom admitted to every substantive allegation, if the charges reflected the full scope of his predatory behavior, and if the recommended sentence was substantial enough to reflect the gravity of the crimes. There would be no sweetheart deal, no reduced charges that minimized what Tom had done to Louis and the other victims. The negotiations were complicated by Tom's status as Queen Camilla's son. Defense attorneys argued that a trial would be unnecessarily damaging to the royal family and to the victims themselves. Prosecutors countered that justice could not be compromised simply because the defendant had powerful connections. The tension between protecting victims from trauma and ensuring full accountability played out in conference rooms and legal briefs, with each side trying to claim the moral high ground. Camilla had maintained her commitment to non-interference, but the cost to her personally had been devastating. She had not spoken to Tom since his arrest, following legal advice that any contact could be construed as witness tampering. She had, however, hired him an attorney and provided financial support for his defense. Actions she justified as a mother's basic duty, even as she maintained public distance from the case itself. The Queen Consort's relationship with William and Catherine remained strained. They were civil in the rare official occasions where they needed to interact, but the warmth that had gradually developed over years was gone. Catherine found it difficult to look at Camilla without thinking about Tom's crimes, while William struggled with resentment over what he saw as years of his son's suffering, while Tom enjoyed family privileges. King Charles was caught in the middle, trying to maintain both his marriage and his relationship with his son and grandchildren. The media had begun to catch wind that something significant was happening. Reporters noticed Louis's absence from public events, the change in Catherine's schedule, and the unusual police activity around the palace. Speculation ranged from wild conspiracy theories to surprisingly accurate guesses. The palace press office was preparing for the inevitable day when the news would break, knowing that the revelation would trigger a media frenzy unlike anything the modern monarchy had faced. A particularly difficult moment came when Tom's formal plea hearing was scheduled. Louis had requested to attend, wanting to look Tom in the eye when he admitted his guilt. Catherine and William were torn, recognizing their son's need for that confrontation, but terrified of the emotional impact. Dr. Chen recommended allowing it, with strict parameters and immediate support available. She explained that victims often needed to see their abusers held accountable in concrete ways to fully internalize that they were believed and that justice was real. The hearing took place in a private courtroom with strict security and confidentiality measures. Louis sat between his parents, wearing a suit that suddenly made him look older and more vulnerable at the same time. Tom was brought in wearing civilian clothes, looking haggard and diminished from the confident figure he had been just months before. When their eyes met across the courtroom, Louis did not flinch or look away. He had worked too hard in therapy to reach this moment to let shame or fear dictate his response now. Tom's lawyer read the negotiated plea agreement. Tom would plead guilty to 3 counts of sexual exploitation of a minor and 2 counts of grooming with intent to commit a sexual offense. In exchange for the guilty plea, several more technical charges would be dropped, and the prosecution would recommend a sentence of 8 years, with possibility of parole after serving 2/3. Tom would be placed on the sex offender registry for life and would be prohibited from any unsupervised contact with minors upon release. The judge turned to Tom directly and asked if he understood the charges and was pleading guilty freely and voluntarily. Tom's response was quiet, but clear enough to be recorded. He admitted his guilt to each charge, acknowledging that he had engaged in inappropriate behavior with minor children, including Prince Louis, and that his actions were wrong and harmful. It was not an eloquent statement of remorse, but it was an admission that could never be taken back. Louis's hands had been trembling throughout the hearing, but when Tom spoke those words of admission, something shifted. Catherine felt her son take a deep, shuddering breath beside her, as if releasing something that had been trapped inside him for months. Hearing his abuser admit the truth, having his experience validated in the most official way possible, provided a vindication that no amount of parental reassurance could have achieved. The judge addressed Tom at length about the seriousness of his crimes. She spoke about the betrayal of trust, the exploitation of his position and access, and the lasting harm caused to young people who had every reason to feel safe around him. She acknowledged that his guilty plea had spared the victims the trauma of a trial, but made clear that this consideration was not sufficient to warrant leniency beyond the negotiated agreement. The sentence would stand as written, 8 years in prison, with Tom to be immediately taken into custody. As Tom was led away by security officers, he glanced back once at the courtroom. His eyes found not Louis, but his mother, sitting in the back row. Camilla's face was a mask of controlled devastation, tears running silently down her cheeks as she watched her son taken away. She had not violated her commitment to non-interference, but neither could she stay away from this moment. The agony of loving someone who had done terrible things was written in every line of her posture. Outside the courthouse, William and Catherine held a brief, carefully worded statement. They thanked the police and prosecutors for their thorough work, praised the courage of all the victims who had come forward, and expressed hope that the outcome would send a clear message that no one was above accountability. They did not mention Tom by name or reference his connection to the royal family, maintaining a professional distance that still managed to convey their complete support for the verdict. Louis had not wanted to make any public statement, but he had written a victim impact statement that was read in court. In it, he described the fear and confusion he had experienced, the way Tom's actions had stolen his sense of security, and the difficult journey toward healing that he was still navigating. He wrote about the importance of speaking up, even when it seemed impossible, and his hope that his story might help other young people find the courage to report abuse. The statement had devastated everyone who heard it, including the judge, who had to pause for a moment before continuing with the sentencing. Louis's words captured both the horror of what he had endured and the resilience he was finding within himself. It was the voice of a child forced to grow up too quickly, but determined not to let that trauma define his entire future. Sergeant James Morrison had followed the case from a distance, grateful that his moment of breakdown that morning had not been in vain. He learned that his emotional response had actually been noted positively in internal reviews, seen as evidence of proper human concern rather than a failure of duty. The Royal Guard had even instituted new training protocols around recognizing and responding to signs of abuse, with James asked to contribute to the program development. In the months following the sentencing, life at the palace slowly found a new normal, though it could never return to what it had been before. Louis continued therapy and gradually re-engaged with public life. Though his parents were fiercely protective of his schedule and boundaries, he had missed much of the school year, but was working with tutors to stay on track academically. The experience had changed him fundamentally, robbing him of a carefree childhood, but also revealing a strength and courage that would serve him throughout his life. The relationship between the Wales family and Camilla remained complicated. She had kept her word about supporting the investigation and accepting the outcome. But trust once broken is not easily repaired. King Charles tried to bridge the gap, but he too had been changed by the crisis. Forced to confront the reality that his blended family contained darker elements than he had wanted to acknowledge. Some family gatherings resumed, but they were careful, controlled affairs, nothing like the relaxed celebrations they had once been. Tom's sentencing had created ripples throughout the extended royal family and aristocratic circles. Other families quietly began asking difficult questions about people they had trusted around their children. Several other investigations were opened into individuals whose behavior in hindsight raised concerns. The scandal had forced an entire class of privileged society to confront the fact that predators could exist anywhere, even in the most supposedly protected and vetted environments. For Louis, the journey of healing would be lifelong. He had good days and difficult days, moments of hope and periods of struggle, but he was surrounded by love, protected by parents who had proven they would fight any battle necessary to keep him safe, and supported by professionals who understood trauma and recovery. He had learned terrible lessons about betrayal and vulnerability, but also profound truths about courage, justice, and the power of speaking truth, even when it seemed impossible. The young prince also found unexpected support from others who had experienced similar trauma. Support groups for young survivors of abuse became an important part of his healing process, connecting him with peers who understood in ways that even his loving family could not. These connections helped Louis realize that while his circumstances were unique in some ways, the core experience of violation and recovery was sadly universal. He was not alone, and his willingness to come forward had helped create space for others to do the same. As spring arrived and flowers bloomed in the palace gardens, there was a sense of cautious renewal. The immediate crisis had passed, justice had been served, and the family was finding ways to move forward while carrying the weight of what had happened. The palace staff noticed that Prince Louis seemed to smile more easily now, that some of the shadow had lifted from his young face. He still had difficult moments, times when something would trigger a memory or a fear. But he was learning to navigate those challenges with growing confidence. Sergeant James Morrison stood at his post one morning in late April, watching Louis walk through the courtyard with his siblings on their way to a family event. The young prince looked up and, recognizing the guard who had silently witnessed his darkest moment, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. James nodded back, maintaining his professional composure, but inside he felt a profound sense of relief. The boy was going to be okay. It would take time, probably years, but Louis would survive this and eventually thrive. The story of what happened that October morning would eventually be written into palace history, though many details would remain private, out of respect for the victims. It would stand as a testament to the importance of believing children when they speak about abuse, of pursuing justice regardless of power or privilege, and of the human capacity to break down in the face of horror, while still finding the strength to stand back up. The royal guard who shattered in tears, the young prince who found his voice, and the family that had to choose between loyalty and truth had all been forever changed by those terrible days. But in the aftermath, they had also discovered reserves of courage and humanity that transcended titles, duty, and tradition.